I would
Oh, yeah.
love to have the people out there learn a little bit about you and your family and how, what brings you guys to be professional mead makers.
Yeah, it was, it was honestly just we decided to be professional mead makers. I mean, I know that in the email I mentioned it. I mean, I think I had like 5 probably batches of mead under my belt when we went commercial. I mean,
Wow.
seriously, 5. Single hand. But realistically, it's what I started with, and I'd continued to homebrew from there. So I had a lot of homebrewing experience. It just, I hadn't made that many batches of mead. I started with 2, and then I made them every once in a blue moon almost, and made a lot more beer. But, when we got out of college, we moved over here. I mean, we're trained herbalists. That's what we studied in college. That's why I started with mead in the first place, because I was studying the history of plants, the history of European medicine, and you just keep running into the use of these plants in alcohol. There's no two ways about it. And, any herb has been used in alcohol in some way, shape, or form, any of them, it seems like. And so that's kind of where I came into it from more, is actually the plants and the bees themselves, because we saw they were struggling mightily, of course, and thankfully this year we've had a slight uptick in commercial hives, and inevitably a lot of amateur beekeepers aren't even counted in that. I'm sure we're improving there.
Yeah.
But when we started, we were still seeing consistent declines over the course of a full decade and more. And so we looked at it and we said, look, these plants that we value so highly are dependent on these bees. And so is a lot of the food that we prefer to eat. And so we need to do what we can to support them. And so after making 5 batches of mead, I decided to become a commercial mead maker, and I filed the paperwork, and we opened the place on our homebrewing equipment. So we were producing, about 12-gallon batches. It would take 6 to 8 weeks of fermentation time, and we opened with that and continued to recapitalize, kept the day job, and continued to expand until last year I finally quit my day job. So it's been
Congratulations.
100% mead for a little over a year now, and I've gotten quite a bit better in that year than even in the 3 years preceding.
It's a focus thing.
But it really is, and so that's kind of, like I said, I mean, in a nutshell, it's like we got into it from the herbs to begin with.
Had you
so of course
tasted?
I make a lot of herbed meads.
Had you ever tasted mead before making it, or did you?
No. And so I started making mead and tasted it, and of course liked it. And what's interesting is when we were finally just gonna jump into it is when we really intentionally started tasting a lot of different types, whatever we could get our hands on, and kind of seeing where people in the industry fell out. But honestly, for me, I'd always been pretty dry, and I stayed right there as we went commercial. I really have stayed down in those, 1.2, maybe 1.5% residual sugar is kind of the top end of what we produce right now, and we go drier from there. So it's something where I was starting there, and I continued to be there, so we could really showcase the bones of the honey and the plants themselves, and utilize those together more than the sweetness to showcase the honey, basically.
I like that, the bones of the honey.
That is. That's really cool. I like that. I'm really fascinated by the fact that you're coming to this from the point of view of being an herbalist, which is not something that is real common in the mead industry, at least not with the people I know. There's a lot of people very interested in, herbs and how they can be utilized in mead, but you came at it from that other direction. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how that sort of colored your approach to making mead.
Well, I mean, you may have looked at our bottle listing. I mean, it's foundational to what we do, and so what you get down to is, I mean, my wife has like 3,000 hours of clinical experience in Ayurvedic medicine that she gained down in Florida, doing actual body work and essential oil blending, and we've taken multiple more courses, hundreds of hours more training in essential oils. Of course, I then have a bachelor's degree in herbs, so that undergraduate degree in Western herbs. So yeah, I mean, for us, it was always what we're good at, and so that's what we did. And I think really Michelle is an incredible asset because between the two of us, we sit down with a formula, and rose cardamom vanilla is a great example. She was like, dude, let's make that. How have we not made that? So we did. And we tasted the first beta batch, and we just sat there and we smelled it and we tasted it and we interacted with it and just really broke it down and said, you know what, I think it needs about 20% less of the rose petals. I think we need to add 10% more cardamom. And the vanilla is pretty good, maybe just a slight uptick in vanilla.
Huh.
And we made a second batch, and that's what's in the bottles right now.
Nice.
So, and so, that was fundamental, I think, for our approach, is just playing to what we're good at and playing to what we're passionate about, what interests us, and what we know really well. So that's really all it comes down to. We'll come to certain things. Sometimes our poplar metheglin, we put literal cottonwood leaf buds into wine and just infused it for about a week and tasted it, and we said, I need some vanilla, and put that in there. So we just look for the holes in the formula sometimes, where when you taste it, sometimes the mid-note, the middle of the palate is just lacking. And so then we just go into our library, basically, of plants, and we say, okay, what plant fits where we're going here and fits that hole and makes it feel the way that it should. So obviously kind of hard to replicate in some ways.
Yeah.
It's hard to teach in some ways because we'll pull out herbs like Damiana sometimes that most people aren't even familiar with, and we'll say that's the one that's going to be here. Or we'll pull Tulsi out, which is holy basil, and we'll say that's the piece that's missing in this profile. Honestly, that's just sitting down and tasting.
Wow.
And tasting and tasting and tasting and tasting medicinal plants and developing that and smelling them and interacting with how you can actually get into the effects of the growing season on the plant, the effects of the region on the plant. And so that's more what we're about. And you'll see that. Obviously Michael Fairbrother has talked about that. He's like, look, we source true cinnamon, period. Cinnamon verum, because it's better. There are very common points like the cinnamon, for instance, that we know that one is going to be way better than the other. That acacia cinnamon is not going to provide you the richness and softness of flavor that a true cinnamon verum will give you.
Yeah.
But obviously for us, some of it's going to be a little different too.
Well, yeah, and it depends on what you're going for. But you're right. The quality of your ingredients definitely has a huge bearing on the quality of the results.
Oh yeah, critical. We just got in a fresh lemon balm from a farm a few miles away from us here, and it made an incredible difference in the wine. And so you definitely see that. And poplar leaf buds, off of the west coast, over in the Seattle area, up into the mountains there, are much different than the ones here in our area, and those are much different than the ones that you find in Denver. Huh. They smell different, they taste different, they're very profoundly different, and they're very closely related species. But the moisture content of those areas drives a lot of the essential oil production, it seems like, in those. And so some of that's experiential. That's something we've learned, just kind of feeling like, why is our poplar not as concentrated as the stuff off in the Puget Sound, basically?
Totally different environment, though, when you think about it.
Bingo. They have twice the humidity we do in the springtime when you harvest those buds. And they have probably about twice, maybe threefold concentration of essential oils in the finished product. And very different essential oils. So, obviously, we can talk infinite complexity in these things.
I think maybe we need to have you back on and do a plants and their effect on mead show. Honestly, I think that would be really interesting, because it's a whole genre. What got me interested in metheglins, way back when I was first starting out with Got Mead, was I got connected to Cindy Renfro through some friends in the SCA. And Cindy wrote a book called A Sip Through Time, which actually I have that linked on the show page. But it's a book that traces mead recipes going back 400 or 500 years. And the preponderance of plant material that shows up in the mead recipes, going back through time and really up into, 18th and 19th century, is phenomenal. I mean, there really was, like, everything was a Metheglin. You didn't see traditional mead, honey, water, and yeast. No, it had rosemary and cardamom and bay leaves and and all sorts of different stuff in it, and it was just fascinating the things they put in it. Some of which you look at it and go, ew, because tastes then were different. The same thing happens in you look at Renaissance and medieval cooking, and you're like, I totally would never put that on beef, But yet, when you cook, we've cooked some of these things, and yet when you cook them, you think, oh my God, that'll be awful, and it actually turns out to be really good, different but good.
Well, I think we write down the knowledge, perhaps, of our forebears, and one of my favorite quotes personally is just because they're dead doesn't mean they were stupid.
Right, exactly.
And so that's what you look at. But realistically, when you look at the world that they were brewing in, they didn't have sulfites.
No, they didn't.
Those don't exist. So where's your antioxidant protection coming from? It's coming from rosemary, it's coming from thyme, it's coming from oregano, it's coming from these plants, because the essential oils in those plants are, generally speaking, strong antioxidants. They're generally speaking antimicrobials in some way, shape, or form. And so you look, thyme being a great example, has a lot of alcohol-based essential oils. Thymol, that OL group, thymol, kills a ton of different kinds of bacteria. And when you test it, it's actually better than most things at inhibiting bacteria in plates. So I think that there was more of a preservative and antioxidant type of reasoning potentially for these things, as well as, of course, these guys knew what those plants were going to do to their body. That was all they had as far as their medicinal tradition at the time. That's all they had.
Yeah.
And so medicated wines,
alcohol
they
was
would
a
have
good way to
called
make
them.
it taste good.
Yeah, and keep it tasting good, and all of these things.
And also
Maybe
preserve it
hide
because herbs
some
lose their
sulfide.
potency, depending on how you store it, too.
Yeah.
So I think that there's kind of a lot of things playing into that, but that's something that we definitely notice is like, okay, medicated wines were incredibly common across the board. And that's in grape wine and everything else.
A piece of that might have been, coming at the Mary Poppins effect, as I like to call it. Spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. But in this case, it's like, well, if we give you wine, you really won't care what we put in it,
Yeah.
This really sweet, delicious wine that'll make you feel nice and warm inside. Let's do that.
It's got all these other things. Well, Henry VIII, again, going back into the history, Henry VIII was a huge fan of medicinal wines, and actually had a favorite, and you can find it in the Tudor cookbook. He had a favorite, he called it a digestive, and this was a wine that he drank after dinner just about every single day. They kept this stuff on hand in the kitchens at his castle, and it's a wine, not a mead, but it was basically a heavy red that had sugar added to it after it had been soaked on spices, like a great big bag of spices. And then after 24 hours, the spices are pulled out, the wine is strained, sugar is added, then it's served up. And I make this whenever I go to an event, and hilariously, people are like, I gotta have me some of that. And I'm like, dude, I make this on my stove. with like super cheap gallon jugs of Burgundy, So,
like I buy the Carlo Rossi for this. I'm not
pretty
even.
much, yeah, that's exactly. There's like $8 bottles of Burgundy that come in gallon jugs, right? And it makes this wine that you're like, wow, it's so good. Now, obviously, somebody who's a wine taster would be going, man, that's cheap Burgundy. But it's not
if they
really.
can tell, if they can even tell at that point.
Well, yeah, after you've adulterated it that much. But the thing was though is that you go look at all of the old recipes, and they're just full of all sorts of interesting plants. Many of them, like you say, daimonia and holy basil, and some of the stuff that I'm particularly fond of. Some of the dang it, I hate when I draw a blank. There's a pepper ginger. AJ, we were talking about this before.
Galangal.
Thank you, Galangal. That was
Galangal.
Galangal was really popular during the Renaissance period, and it was partly because it was you can't get this if you're a peasant kind of spice, but also because it had so many different uses to it, so.
Oh, I made a terrible orange Galangal mead one time. Just bringing me back.
It's
Just
really,
bringing me